In this video, I'm going to show you how much more powerful pieces are near the centre of the board. When the worksheet appears on the screen, pause the video and either take a print out of the screen or draw your own grid. Great! We're going to start filling in the grid, one column at a time. Let's put a knight on E4. How many squares can this knight move to? That's 8 squares. Enter the number 8 in your grid like this. OK, now let's put the knight on E2. How many squares can the knight move to now? That's only 6 squares. Enter the number 6 in your grid like this. Right, now let's put the knight on E1. How many squares can the knight move to now? That's only 4 squares. Enter the number 4 in your grid like this. Right, now let's put the knight on G1. How many squares can the knight move to now? That's only 3 squares. Enter the number 3 in your grid like this. Finally, let's put the knight in the corner. How many squares can the knight move to now? Only 2 squares. Put the number 2 in your grid to complete the first column. So as you can see, the closer the knight is to the centre of the board, the more choices it has, the more powerful it is. Let's look at the bishop now. Let's put one on E4. How many squares can this bishop move to? 3 that way, another 3 that way, another 3 that way, and another 4 that way. A total of 13. Enter 13 in your grid like this. OK, now it's your turn. Pause the video and see if you can fill in the rest of this column. How did you get on? Let's have a look. On E2 the bishop can move to 9 squares. On E1 the bishop can move to 7 squares. On G1, 7 squares. And finally on H1, 7 squares. Again, the closer to the centre, the more choice, the more powerful the bishop is. OK, have a go at the rook and fill in the next column. How did that go? Let's go through the answers. On E4 the rook can move to 14 squares. On E2 the rook can move to 14 squares. On E1 the rook can move to 14 squares. On G1, 14 squares. And finally on H1, 14 squares. The rook is different. You can put the rook anywhere, and it will always have 14 squares it can go to. Right, now have a go at the queen and fill in the next column. Remember, the queen can move in any direction. How did that go? Let's go through the answers. On E4 the queen can move to 27 squares. On E2 the queen can move to 23 squares. On E1 the queen can move to 21 squares. On G1, 21 squares. And finally on H1, 21 squares. Do you notice that if you add the numbers in the bishop and rook columns, you get the queen column? That makes sense, because the queen can move like a bishop or a rook. Right, now have a go at the king and fill in the last column. Remember, the king can move in any direction too. How did that go? Let's go through the answers. On E4 the king can move to 8 squares. On E2 the king can move to 8 squares. On E1 the king can only move to 5 squares. On G1, again it's 5 squares. And finally on H1 it's only 3 squares. So the final column should look something like this. Even the king is more powerful in the middle of the board. But it's best to wait until most of the pieces are gone before charging around with your king. You need to keep your king safe. And so here is the complete grid. Rooks are quite happy on the edge of the board, but other than that, it is a good plan to keep your pieces closer to the centre of the board, but only if it's safe. So keep your king on the edge until later in the game.